SSRS deployment and migration. If you're going to build a house, you better know how much square footage you're going to need. If you don't plan appropriately, then eventually you'll grow out of it and you'll have to move, which involves time and money. Well, the same thing applies to determining the spacing requirements for your SSRS reports. In this nugget, we'll talk about the space requirements for your report server database as well as the report server temp database. And then we'll go into the deployment scenarios. There's 4 different general deployment scenarios that are possible. For example, you might want to have your report server running on the same machine as the report server database, or you might decide to separate them out for scalability. We'll also take a look at the different steps that you need to take for deployment. And then the last thing we'll talk about is automation. If you have several servers that you need to deploy, you might want to automate the task using the WMI provider. Just as a little bit of review here, whenever you're using SSRS, you're going to be dealing with 2 different databases. One is the report server database itself, which contains all the metadata about the reports. And then, of course, there's the report server temp database, and that's used as a temporary area for the different sessions that are utilizing the reports. Well, let's first of all talk about the sizing for your report server database. An average size report is going to consume between 100 and 200 kilobytes of space. Larger reports can even go up to 400 kilobytes. When you're determining the size of your report server database, you need to keep in mind how many reports you're going to be dealing with, as well as whether it's a small, medium, or large report. And you can even do some queries on the report server database to see how large exactly some of these reports are. You also need to keep in mind snapshots. You might keep history snapshots of your various reports. Typically, the snapshots are going to be 1/5 the size of a regular report. So if you're deciding to keep 5 snapshots of a report, keep that in mind. Also, as a general rule of thumb, reports that use aggregation, such as sums, are going to be slightly smaller than reports that don't use aggregations. As far as sizing your RS temp database, you need to take into consideration the max number of users you're going to have at any given time. For example, let's say that we have a total of 1,000 users that are ever going to be accessing your reports. Well, typically, you're going to have a maximum of 20% of those users concurrently accessing the reports as a max. In other words, that would be about 200 users at the most ever accessing the reports. Well, when those users are accessing the reports, it's going to take a snapshot of the report, and that's going to remain in the RS temp database for that session. So let's take a look at this one example. Let's make an assumption that we have 500 total users, and they're all trying to access a 20 megabyte report at some given time. So we take that 500 and we multiply it by 20%, or 0.2. And that 20 megabyte report, well, we multiply that by 20 megs here, and what we get is about 2,000 megabytes or 2 gigs. So what you want to take into account here is how many reports you have, how large those reports are, and what the concurrency is going to be for report access of all those users. Now, when you're in that initial development environment for your reports, you're not going to know beforehand how large those reports are going to be. So you need to make that determination as you develop those reports. Then when you actually deploy all of this onto a production environment, you determine the appropriate sizing. Next, I want to talk about the different deployment scenarios. Before we get into that, we need to do a little bit of review of the SSRS architecture. Okay, so in the center of all this, we have our report server, which is the main engine. The report server, of course, talks to our different data sources. For many of the examples we've been doing, we've been tapping into our AdventureWorks database. Notice that it can be multiple data sources. We also have our report server database as well as the report server temp database. So the report server database contains the meta information about our reports, and the report server temp database is for the individual sessions, and that information in the temp database remains until those sessions close. For administration purposes, we have our report manager, which is typically accessed through the web interface, but we can also access it through our WMI interface. And then we have our report designer environment where we can go into our business intelligence development studio and actually design those reports. And we can allow end users to use the report builder to build their own reports based on some various metadata about the underlying databases. I want to emphasize that in SSRS 2008 there's no longer a dependency on the IIS web server. However, if you want to stick with that, it is backwards compatible. So now let's look at some of our deployment scenarios here. Here we have the most simplest scenario. It's called the single server deployment scenario, where you've got a client that's talking to a report server, and the report server is then talking to that report server database, and these two guys are sitting on the same machine. Now, out of the box, this is the default behavior of SSRS. If you decide that your performance is fine and you don't have any space issues, then you can just stick with this scenario. If you discover that there's a little bit of contention, then you might want to separate these out into two different servers. So we have the client talking to a report server on one machine, and then the report server database on yet another machine. Now, there might be scenarios where you have a lot of clients, and even this situation isn't enough. If you find that you have a lot of connections and the report server is getting pounded, then you might decide to have a load balancer. So you'll have that client talk to a machine that contains a load balancer, and then that in turn talks to two or more report servers. So this is what we call the scale-out server. And then those numerous report servers, we call them nodes, then talk to the report server database. We'll go into much greater detail on scale-out scenarios in a later nugget. If you determine that in this environment the report server database is still getting pounded, then you might want to have multiple report server databases so you can scale out that database itself. Now, there's yet one more deployment scenario called the advanced scale-out server. So notice in this diagram here we have an interactive client that might be generating some ad hoc reports, and then that talks to a load balancer just like we did earlier, which then talks to two or more report servers, and then that talks to the report server database. Now, we also have some scheduled reports that talks to a file server, which in turn talks to the report server and then to the database itself. In other words, we're separating out the interactive or the ad hoc clients from the scheduled reports. Now that you understand the basic deployment scenarios, let's talk about the steps involved with the actual deployment itself of your report server. So we have 9 main steps here for deploying your report server. The first one is to install the reporting services. Now, this involves running the setup.exe file, which comes with your SQL Server 2008 installation disk. When you run this file, you can go through the wizard, which will take you through all of these steps. But if you don't know all of the necessary information up front, you can just choose to install the reporting services just by itself, which just includes the basic files. And then later you can choose to configure everything else. So this next step is to configure the service account. Once again, this can be done through the setup.exe file, or you can have your custom code which taps into the WMI provider. We'll talk more about the WMI provider to programmatically make these modifications. Anything that's in red on this page shows you what you need to do in order to automate any of these tasks. Our third step is to configure the report server web service and the report manager URLs. This is where you can determine the port number that the server is sitting on, as well as which host it's sitting on. Remember, the report server might be on a different machine from the report database itself. You'll want to create a report server database. And this is the step that you take into consideration how large do you want to make this database. You'll need to provide a guesstimation of how many reports you have, as well as the number of concurrent users you might have. If you've already created a report server database and you later decide that you want to change it, you can also do that. Most of these steps here on this page can be accessed by going to the report server configuration tool, which I'll show you in just a moment. The fifth step is to configure your report server database connection. This can also be done through the rsconfig.exe file. And then on the next step, step 6, you can configure the scale out. Now this is optional. If you determine that your report server is getting pounded by many users, you can have report servers on 2 or more nodes. So once again, this is something where you might have a standalone report server and then later decide to scale it out. You can configure this through the rs-keymanagement.exe file as well, or you can do it through custom code if you'd like. Regardless if you have a single report server or multiple report servers, you will want to back up your encryption keys. We do this just in case your whole installation goes corrupt. You'll need to remember or store the encryption key password somewhere in a safe place. Step number 8 is dealing with the report server email. You do want to make sure that you have some kind of SMTP email server up and running. And you'll also need to know where it is. In other words, the IP address or the host name as well as the port number that it's sitting on. You can configure this as well through custom code that's tapping into the WMI provider. And then the last step is to configure the unattended execution account. You absolutely need to perform this step if you want to enable snapshots. Let's make the assumption here that you've already installed your reporting services, just the basic files, using setup.exe, and then you want to go in and use the graphical user interface to make the rest of the configuration changes. Well, to do that, you'll need to go into your program files, then SQL Server 2008, Configuration Tools. Under there, you're going to find the Report Server Configuration Manager. It looks like this, and it's automatically going to prompt you for the server name that it sits on and the report server instance. There might be multiple instances, so make sure you select the right one. Hit connect, and I'll just resize this so you can see it all. And here we have all of our different options here. From this main landing page, you can choose to start and stop the service. And this is where you can make any modifications or set up the initial configuration. So in my case, the service account, instead of using a network service or local system or local service, we're instead using a Windows domain account. So the name of my server is Julie1. In your case, it's probably something else. And then the username is Julie, and of course there's the Windows password for that user. We can then configure our web service URL. We use this web service URL to communicate primarily through the SOAP API. Remember in our earlier nugget, we talked about the SOAP interface so we can communicate with the manager or with the reports. Well, you'll see here that we have our virtual directory. This is called Report Server, and you can override the default name if you want to. And then we have the IP address. Now, this is pretty important here. You can override the IP address with any of these values in the drop-down, or you can stick with the recommended value. Out of the box, the TCP port is actually going to be port 80, and if you don't specify anything there, that's what it defaults to. I happen to have something else running on port 80 on my machine, so I used port 8079, since you can't have two programs running on the same port. Now, right now, my SSL certificate is not being used. We want to use SSL if we have sensitive data that's getting transferred back and forth. If you're going to utilize this feature, you need to first of all make sure that you have some kind of tool that generates a certificate. You can use some third party such as VeriSign, or you can use a free tool just for testing and development. For example, I used a tool called SSL Diagnostics. You can actually just go to Google, search for this, download it, it's free, and you can use this tool to generate that certificate. So once you have created a certificate, you can then specify that you're using this. So my certificate name here was called Julie1, and this is the SSL port that it's sitting on. I can override that port number if I want to. So when I scroll down here, these are the URLs. Notice that I have HTTPS, and then it's utilizing that port number that I just specified. We can go in here under Advanced, and we can add multiple SSL identities if we want to. If we want to have more than one URL, we can just go into Advanced and add more as needed. Our next screen has to do with the database for our report server. So right now, here's the server name, and here's the database name, and our report server mode is native as opposed to SharePoint. I'll show you in a little while how to configure your SharePoint server. If you scroll down a little bit, it also shows us our report server database credentials. So right now it's using the Windows account, the user Julie, and of course the Windows password. You can always go in there and change the credentials if you want to. So these are the credentials that are used to tap into the database itself. Next we have the URL for our report manager. The virtual directory for that is reports, and you can override that if you want to. Similar to what we covered for the web service, we have this little advanced button right here, and this is where you can configure SSL. So I might go in here and add the Julie 1 certificate, and this will be running on port 443. It takes a couple seconds for this to configure, but it looks like the URL was successfully created, and there's the URL. As far as your email settings, before you configure anything in here, you need to first of all make sure that you have an SMTP server up and running. It doesn't have to be on the same machine, it can be on a remote machine. Just make sure that you have access to it on the network. The particular tool that I'm using for my email server is called Free SMTP Server. I just found it from softstack.com, and it's just a quick and dirty testing environment for emails. In your production environment, you'll probably want to use something a little bit more robust. So my sender address, I'm going to configure this to be julie@cbtnuggets.com. And for the SMTP server here, I have my server on localhost. By default, it's on the SMTP port number of 25. You can override that by doing a colon and then the overridden port number if you want to. And then you can click on the execution account. And this execution account is used if you have data sources that don't require credentials, or if you're connecting to remote servers that store external images that are used in reports. So with this, you want to specify a Windows account. So in my case, my domain name is Julie1 and my username is Julie, and then I have my password in here. Make sure that this is a user account that has minimal privileges. You don't want this to be a system administrator. Otherwise, you're just opening yourself up to too many security issues. So if I wanted to change this, for example, to user Bob, who has less privileges, I can do that. And I'm now going to put in his password right in here. And then we can hit apply. Sometimes it takes a couple seconds for those changes to take effect. And then for the encryption keys, you might want to change your encryption keys on a regular basis, especially if you have employees in your company leaving the company. You want to make sure you back them up, change the password, and so on. So just in case your installation goes bad, you're going to need the encryption key to reinstall without clobbering all of your data. And so you can just hit backup on here, and you specify the file location of where you want that saved to, and then you'll provide a password. So here I'm just going to save mine to the local C drive, and I'll just call this keys, or SSRS keys. Save that right there, and then I'll put in my password, which I'll note somewhere in a safe place. So then when we restore, you use the same location of your key as well as the same password. Our next nugget is going to describe in detail what you need to do for your scale-out deployment. But essentially, you would be adding more nodes so you have more report servers, so this one standing alone doesn't get so pounded. Now, that is the graphical interface of making these modifications. I want to talk about automating this if you really want to scale out. Modifying these configurations programmatically could save you a lot of time in the long run. If you do want to programmatically modify any of the configuration settings using the WMI provider, here are some general guidelines. So this WMI provider is used to allow the report server and the database to be managed remotely and locally. It can be used to discover which machines are using reporting services, and it can also be used to just look at the different properties and set the properties. Another usage of it is to activate report server instances into scale-out deployment. So let's say that you have 10 report server instances. Instead of using the graphical interface to do this, you can programmatically do it. Now there's two main classes that we use to tap into our WMI provider, and that is the MS Report Server Instance and the MS Report Server Configuration Setting. Both of them use the system.management namespace, so you need to make sure that for your project that you reference system.management. Just to show you what I'm talking about, what we've got here is Visual Basic 2008. I'm just using Express Edition. And I'm just going to display the different report server instances. We can programmatically do this. I'm just going to say File, New Project, and let's make this a console application. Let's call this WMI Provider 1. You can really call it anything you want to. And what we end up here with is a module. Now we need to right-click on this project and we need to add a reference. We're going to be using a particular class here which belongs to this namespace. So go down to system.management and just double click on that. And then once you've done that, then you can have some import statements. So we're going to say import system.management. We're also going to import just system as well as system.io. Next, I'm going to connect to my management class. So you'll see here that we have a namespace. This is the local host. What we're doing is we're looking on our local host to see if we have any report server instances. So the path is going to be localhost root Microsoft SQL Server, report server, and so on. Get down to that admin right there. That's the namespace. And then we also have the class path, which is almost identical. Really at the end here we have our report server underscore configuration setting. You can find all of these namespaces also on the MSDN books online. They have pretty good documentation. So we have here a variable called server class. It's of type management class, and we have scope, which is of type management scope. We create this scope right here, passing in the namespace that was declared right up here, and then we connect to it. So really we're dealing with two main classes here. One is the management scope class, and the other is the management class. If anything goes wrong, then we'll know that by an exception thrown on this line right here. So at this point we can just hit run. And all we got was just a little warning down here saying unused local constant. Not a big deal. We don't have any errors, so we're good to go. Next, we're going to find the different instances. So here we've declared this server class. It's a management class object, passing in this string right up here. And then we call the get method. And here we call the server class dot get instances. So if we have multiple instances of a report server, this will be returned as a management object collection. So once we have that, then we declare our instance as a management object. So all we're doing in this for loop is we're looping through each of our management objects. For each instance detected, it will print out to the console, instance detected. And then we have this instant properties. It's just a collection of properties, and we're going to be looping through those. So that's what this for each loop is doing right here. So all we're doing is we have two loops here. Our outer loop is looping through the instances. Our inner loop is looping through the properties of the instance. And at the very bottom here is just printing out press any key, and the console.read key is just preventing our window from disappearing. So I'm just going to run this right now. And this is what I got here. Let me scroll up a little bit. One instance was detected. It tells me the database logon account, as well as the logon timeout, It tells us our database name, as well as the server name. It tells us whether the report manager is enabled and whether SharePoint is integrated in here. So it's not integrated yet with SharePoint. We can fix that. And so on. And it even gives us the path name, the sender email address, and so on. So I can programmatically go through here and change any of these values if I want to. So getting back to our code here, if we wanted to go through our instances and change any of the properties, we can do that by calling the set properties. Okay, so for example here I'm going to say instance dot set property value, and maybe I want to change the database query timeout. Maybe I'll change that to be let's say 500 seconds. Now when we run this, you'll see that right up here, here's my database query timeout. So you can see the list of the valid properties that you can modify through here, or you can go through the official documentation on the MSDN website. If you want to make your changes stick, you can also, right after that statement, say instance.put to save those changes. You could also go in here and programmatically set the execution account. All you would need to do is change this database query timeout to say unattended execution account, and instead of 500, you would put in double quotes the domain name, backslash, and the username. Well, guess what? There's yet another tool to do that, and that's called rsconfig.exe. If you open up a DOS prompt, I'll show you how to do this. Here I'm at my DOS prompt. If I type in rsconfig-help, we can see all the different options here. And to set the unattended execution account, the combination of options would be the -e for the execution account. And then if you scroll down a little bit, use -u for the username, -p for the password, and if you want to put the results to a trace file, use the -t option. So I might say here, for example, rsconfig-e-u, maybe I want to change it from Bob to Julie, so I would do this. Then I provide the password for the Windows Julie account, which in my case is secret, and then -t for the trace file. And this should only take a couple seconds, and it completed successfully. So now if I go back to my Visual Basic environment and I hit run on this, we can see that the changes have stuck. You'll see right there. Let's review what we learned in this nugget. We first of all reviewed the architecture for SSRS. It involves the main engine, which is the report server, which then talks to the report server database, and you'll also need the report server temp database for your sessions. We discussed the spacing requirements for your report server and the temp database. Things to take into consideration are the total number of concurrent users you think you're going to have, as well as the size of the reports and whether or not you're using aggregations. We looked at the different deployment scenarios. You might have the report server on the same machine as the report server database, or you might decide to separate them out. If you find that your report server is getting hit really hard by users, then you might decide to have multiple report servers. So that's what we call the scale-out deployment, and we'll discuss that in our next nugget. As far as setting up your SQL Server, you can do that through your setup.exe when you initially install it, or you can choose to go in there through the report server configuration tool to later set things up or make modifications. The third option is to go in there programmatically using your WMI provider interface. Then the last thing we talked about was automation. So we delved a little further into using our WMI provider to programmatically make modifications. We also looked at our rsconfig.exe tool, which lets us do things such as set the unattended execution account. Well, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.